Welcome everyone to this evening's event. I am Scott Edgar. I'm the Assistant Arts and Cultural Programmer at Belfast Linen Hall Library. For those of you unfamiliar with the Linen Hall Library, we're the oldest such institution in Belfast, and we are the only library in Ireland that generates a proportion of our income from our members. If you enjoy this evening's event, please do visit our website and find out more about how you can become a member of the library. For now, like I said, we place everyone on mute. If you have any questions or comments for our guest tonight, please type them in the chat box and we will get back to them at the end. At the Linen Hall Library, our Extraordinary Women project has been digitising archives relating to women's history and culture. And as we have some extraordinary women writers joining us virtually this evening, I should mention that many of those items come from women's writers in our literary archives. Another part of the project is contemporary collecting, and this will include new publications and pieces written by community participants to add to the archive. An Extraordinary Women website will make tens of thousands of items available to view digitally and to download later in the year. And we're thankful to be able to include work from this evening's speakers in those archives. You can find out more about the Extraordinary Women project on our website, linenhall.com. But for now, we will quickly move on, and for the rest of the evening, you'll be left in the capable hands of this evening's Extraordinary Women. We have with us this evening some of Ireland's greatest writers. I caught up with everyone a little earlier today to record the first session of this evening's chat, therefore ensuring we would face no technical difficulties. However, all of our authors and speakers and guests tonight are on hand if you have any questions, which they will field at the end. Like I said, if you have any questions or comments, type them into the chat box and we will get back to them at the end, time permitting. Now, I have to admit that, as I said there, we did record this earlier to circumnavigate any technical issues. There are always technical issues. And I will hold my hands up and say that as the only man in the room this morning, I messed up and I forgot to turn my microphone off while some of our guests were speaking. So for about the first 7 or 8 minutes, you may hear a little bit of echo or a little bit of distortion on the audio. We will just be playing the interview back, so I can't do anything about that right now other than apologise, and hopefully it won't detract too much from what is a really, really great interview. And on that note, we will let the interview commence.
Well, I'm delighted to be here tonight, chatting to 3 of Ireland's best writers. And thanks very much to Scott Edgar for inviting us. It's a real pleasure to be in the beautiful Linen Hall Library, even remotely. We're here to celebrate the publication of Look, It's a Woman Writer, which was published by Arlen House a few months ago. The cover is by a Belfast artist, the fantastic Rosie McGuckin. The book is an anthology of 21 essays by writers from the north and south of Ireland who have in common that they are all women and that they were all born in around the middle of the last century, the 20th century, as you know. Since they were born in the 1950s, a great deal has changed on this island for everyone, but especially for women and for women who are artists or writers. In the 1950s, concepts like gender equality were hardly heard of. In the Republic, married women were obliged to resign from jobs in the civil service as soon as they married, and very few women had careers outside the home. Women who did work were paid less than men in the same jobs. And like everything else, the literary scene was dominated by men. But as we 1950s babies grew up, things began to change. Without going into detail, and there's lots of detail in the book, we can say that we've moved from a time when the literary playing field was quite unequal, where women writers were not as numerous and certainly not as prominent or as important as men, to a much more egalitarian environment. And I and the other women in this anthology, 3 of whom are here tonight, have lived and written through this period of change. I think everyone is affected by history and environment. We are caught in the nets of where we live and when we live, but everyone has a unique personal experience of it. So All the women in this anthology lived through the same time of change, but they all have their own perspectives and views. And so their stories have some things in common, but mostly they're different. So there are 21 different stories about living as a writer through this period. And tonight I'm going to discuss these and their own writing lives with three of Ireland's most illustrious and talented writers, Sophia, Hillan, Mcguckian, and Devlin. Sophia Hillan is a scholar, a critic, and a fiction writer. She has a PhD from Queen's University, where she worked for many years as Assistant Director of the School of Irish Studies. Her scholarly work includes books on Michael McClaverty and Sam Hannibal, and an absolutely fantastic biographical account of the story of Jane Austen's nieces, May, Lou, and Cass, who lived in Remelton, County Donegal. Sophie has written 3 collections of short stories. The Cocktail Hour is the most recent and has won many prizes. Mcguckin is also a graduate of Queen's and has been a writer in residence there at various times. Her first collection of poems, Single Ladies, was published in 1980. And since then, there are at least 21 books, collections and selections by her. She's stylistically, Mcguckin has been a groundbreaking and the most innovative of Irish poets. She's one of our most famous poets, and she's travelled widely, and her work is the subject of many critical commentaries by Irish, British, and international researchers. She's been the recipient of innumerable awards, starting with the British National Poetry Competition, which she won when she started writing in the 1970s, and writes about very wryly in her very amusing essay. And she's won many other prizes. Anne Devlin is also the recipient of lots of prestigious literary awards, starting with the Hennessy Award for a short story in 1982, the Samuel Beckett Award, the Susan Blackburn Award, and others. Anne writes short stories, plays, and film scripts. She's a graduate of the New University of Ulster, and she's lectured in the University of Birmingham, the University of Lund in Sweden, and Trinity College in Dublin. She's written 5 books, 4 published by Faber, and as we will hear, she's also been a political activist. Her experiences in turbulent Northern Ireland have echoes in her writing. So I'm going to start by asking Medbh McGuckian to tell her something about the early days. Medbh's essay opens up: in the 1950s, I wrote endless compositions in a neat backhand. They were always getting me to turn into italic. They were as far away from real life as I was a boarder in Mallory Towers with my own drift, like a good lot of writers in the anthology, though not everyone. Can you tell me something about the early days?
Well, I did make it a bit difficult for my parents at this point, but my mother was a primary school teacher, and I just consider myself as a small child and these adults talking about me to other adults, and I'm about 3, and my father is saying, "Oh, our Maeve can read the newspaper. She's only 3," and it's ironic that I don't like newspapers. I never read newspapers now. I never have after the age of 3. So, what did I say? I think the idea of reading was always very enjoyable to me. It was always an escape from a rather dark existence. The 50s were in Belfast, still recuperating from the war. And I was obsessed with war, even before we had our lovely little cotton war here. And I would come down to my parents screaming that there was going to be a bomb if there was a plane went over, that kind of thing, you know. I'd also come down and tell them that my heart had stopped. And, you know, I think now they were very, very generous to me because I was quite difficult. So the reading came first and then the writing, and I think that still holds for me. And maybe other writers as well. We're just discussing here reading Mary Lavin, and probably for me, reading Mary Lavin then become writing something about that, you know. My grandmother was very extremely erotically religious, extremely. I mean, I realize why, but at the time I just thought she was mad. You know, she used to read the St. Martin magazine, and then she write the name of the saint that she discovered on the kitchen wall, you know, and then she'd say, "Oh, I've discovered this new thing called Bonaventure," and I'm going, right, and it's written on the wall. So that was interesting for me. That was interesting for me. Mother was quite different. My mother, she loved the Victorian English poets like Tennyson, and she loved Omar Khayyam. And eventually she had a friend, an English woman who had actually published a book of poetry. So when I was like 10, I was shown this book, and my mother said, "Look, you know," well, she didn't say, "Look, it's a woman writer." She said, "Look, it is possible for a woman to publish a book of poetry." And I think it had been published like by a vanity press, but I remember it was called, how's it called? Wild Books, and I read it voraciously and learned the poems and liked it very much and used it as a key. Her father would have read all of Dickens, you know, at night. She would have read the stories of Dickens at night, and she talked about that quite a lot. Let's see. My father loved Robert Burns, and he also loved Patriot Song, and he taught the boys in school, you know, Croppy Lie Down and all these, you know, books that he shouldn't have been, and songs that probably wouldn't have been on the syllabus, but he did that. And let me see. I think the church was the dominant influence on us. We lived right next door to the church, and the school was there. So it was all bound, the house, the school, and the church, bound together in a very tight knit, brought up not to learn things. I was brought up to learn certain things, like about sin and things, but quite well versed in the commandments and the sins. And the liturgy was very beautiful, and the hymns were very beautiful, and the flowers of the church. But it left out an awful lot of things we might have learned from television when we got one. Things that you just like to hear something interesting, and then mother would say, "Switch that off," you know. So that kind of, I think I just was extremely narrow and extremely protected, but also very, very innocent for a long, long time into the grey age, I would say.
Right, but nevertheless, you went on to study English literature in Queen's University, and you had no doubt encouragement from your family background to do that. And what did you you mentioned that when you were there in the early 1970s, that the syllabus was dominated by works by men. Do you think that affected your literary ambitions in any way?
No, because I mean, we're just sitting here in the Linen Hall and we're surrounded by male pictures of men and books by men. We're just commenting on that, and we're saying, no, you're used to that. You actually take that as part of the wallpaper. You're used to the whole scene, and even the television was very, I mean, women didn't get much of a chance there for a long time anyway. But so you didn't resent it, you just sort of took it for granted. And the thing about Queen's is most of the teachers, most of the lecturers were brought over from England, were brought over from Britain with their wives. I mean, a lot of them would have had that as the incentive to come over to such a benighted province. You would have had a male and his wife teaching in the same school. And again, you didn't sort of question that. You just sort of noticed it and went on. So the really Seamus Heaney was about the only local Irish scholar available. He was so he was very, very popular because he was so strange, and he didn't. Well, his wife wasn't working in the place either, so that was good. But so yeah, so when it came to the syllabus, I mean, you didn't question it was going to be. You know, the funny thing was that if there was a woman in there anywhere like Emily Dickinson, she stood out like a sore thumb. She was crazy, she was demented, and her work was eccentric. And this was probably because she was a woman. Because she was a woman, she was eccentric. And you felt yourself that because you were a woman, and if you were going to be a woman writing, you were going to be eccentric, or in fact, you would have to be eccentric. So I had this notion that, okay, so I'm going to start writing here, but it's going to have to be really crazy stuff. I have to be as crazy as Emily Dickinson in order to be heard. And so that's the way it was, you know.
That's just fantastic. So, I mean, the syllabus, of course, was exactly the same in UCD, and it didn't have the slightest impact on, say, my idea of myself as a writer for whatever reason. I didn't see it, but that, in a way, it pushed you into being innovative and doing something, as you to use your own word, crazy in your writing is so is just so interesting. Like sometimes negative things can push you in the right direction.
Not so sure, really.
Well, I mean, the proof is in the pudding.
In reality, I got crazy. So yeah, but what you want.
What about the poetry scene? You know, because it's one thing taking for granted that all the books you read and the great writers and the canon are men, and we probably didn't notice that. But then when you start, you do write in your essay about going to a poetry reading with your contemporaries. So can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the idea was that you had to be amused in order to get into the wild scene. It wasn't really a wild scene, but it was exciting. It was exciting. There were a lot of writers coming through, but in order to get, you had to become a kind of a muse figure yourself. I mean, it was only when I met Éilis Ní Dhuibhne that we would have discussed the fact that as women writers, we needed to adopt male muses or female muses. In Nuala's case, quite a lot of female muses would have been present. So, you know, they were drinking and they were reading and they were writing. And Seamus Heaney had asked me to go along because he thought it might be good for me. I wouldn't go along to the reading sessions. I went along to the Thursday night readings, mostly from writers who came over from England again, you know, hardly ever during that time from the south. There were hardly any people come up from the south. So it was again pretty colonial, you know, apart from anything else. So
yeah, that's really, you've said so many interesting things. Fantastic. Yeah, and I was reading recently a poem by one of the great Irish language poets written in the 1970s, Isathlum Ban. A woman poet seems odd to me, and he goes on to write in that poem, a woman is poetry, not the poet. So I have heard this before, but just reading it again, I thought, this is unbelievable that somebody could write that in the 1970s. But yeah, you see what people like you and Nuala were So thanks a million, Maeve. That was so wonderful and so full of interesting insights. So can I now move on to I think your old classmate, Sophia, who was in Queen's at the same time as Maeve, maybe even the same year. And you described this in your beautiful essay, so beautifully written, as a glorious time. So did you notice that it was male dominated, or did your feminist epiphany come later?
I didn't have a feminist epiphany.
Okay.
No, I didn't. I can't pretend that I did, because I didn't. I had come out, well, I think we all had come out of the convent school, I mean, 2 different convent schools with the same nuns, and we're very good, wonderful educators. And my memory is of being taught by extremely strong women. Was an enormous influence upon me. So the fact of being taught by men was a surprise to me. And Meg's quite right when James Heaney was a force of nature in that he was a wonderful teacher, an extraordinary teacher, and he knew how to teach. He had trained as a teacher, and that was in itself unusual in the university. Some had a gift, quite a number had a gift for teaching, and some didn't. They wanted to be doing research of that, but it was a heady time, because you must remember it was 1968. We'd had the Paris, the manifestation. It was very exciting. And also being 2 assassinations, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, at the time we were doing our A-levels, all of that disruption, the Prague Spring. There was a feeling that young people were going to change the world. I mean, we were young, 18, you do think you might change the world. I hadn't the slightest idea how to change anything, not even the plug, but I kind of vaguely thought I might change the world. And as to it being male dominated, rather as Maeve said, I didn't particularly expect it to be any other way. But we did have remarkable teaching. Maeve's mentioned Seamus Heaney, who was a marvellous teacher and a very good encourager of the young. And there was also John Cronin, who was Irish. He was Cork, travelled the world, but he was Cork, and he was very important. And it was he who put what was then called Anglo-Irish literature on the syllabus, because when Seamus Heaney had been there a few years before, there had not been Irish literature on the syllabus. The syllabus was Beowulf to Virginia Woolf. Now, it was still largely that when we were there, but we had the option of taking elective courses in Anglo-Irish literature. And I think Maeve herself wrote her master. We did our masters at the same time, her master's dissertation on Gothic women writers. And I think some of those were Irish, if I remember correctly. And she's nodding, so I've got that right. So we had that opportunity to think about Irish writing, and at undergraduate level, Seamus Heaney left at the end of when we were graduating in our primary degrees. So we didn't have him at master's level, but at master's level, you could study Irish literature, you could study 19th century Irish literature or poetry. So all of that was open. And as you went through, we were fortunate to have a 4-year degree. So it became refined as you went along. And we did have some remarkable women lecturers. Edna Longley was a young lecturer then. And there was a marvellous lecturer called Margaret Cardwell, who was also the editor of the Clarendon Dickens. And she was terrific. She was 19th century English literature. We had Peter Devlin, who was an expert in 18th century literature and Scottish literature. So I don't think I ever had any sense of being, of not being part of it. But when I came to think of it, when I came to think of it years later, yes, it did strike me that there were very few women being studied. They were in a category. And but that was gradually changing. It's the same, for example, John Cronin was at that time writing about Somerville and Ross, and we would learn about Somerville and Ross and Maria Edgeworth, and suddenly find out who these people were, who these pioneers of Irish fiction were.
Yeah, so it sounds, listening to that, as if the real innovation, or one of the innovations, was actually introducing Irish literature to the syllabus. And you think, in a way, because of which wasn't an issue in Dublin at the same time, in the university, we would have been studying Irish writers as well as English writers in the I studied English also. Do you think that kind of might have competed with the struggle to introduce that became the important issue, rather than the lack of women in the course, which is an idea I have about feminism in the north of Ireland anyway.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned that earlier when we were talking, Éilís, but you had a feeling that feminism was subsumed beneath the growing question of politics and the terrible divisions. Because remember, we went in '68, and what was happening, demonstrations for civil rights, that's what that was about. And it was cross-community. And that then morphed. We went in '68, '69, '70, the terrible year of '71, '72. So those were our undergraduate years. And we did see everything become very polarized. I suppose, rather as now with COVID-19, we spent a lot of time trying to stay safe. You know, going to the university, I can remember not being able to go across to the university. It wasn't safe to cross the town because we lived at home and traveled every day. In fact, I was sent over to my final year and my master's year, I was sent over to live at the university in a women's hall for women students, because it wasn't safe to travel across the city. So there was that sense of quite often I would not have been thinking about whether I was having a feminist awakening. I was thinking about whether I would get home and what was going on, or whether a bomb would go off. Sometimes something would go off and you would know that was the day you had to have your exam. So to an extent, as an undergraduate, you did have the feeling that you must get on with your work, you must get that done, you must meet your deadlines, but you had to look out as well, you had to be careful. So again, for me anyway, only in retrospect could I see what was happening. I didn't know, for example, until afterwards, I didn't know Meg was writing. Though I knew we were in the same year, and I did know her. I'd known her, I think, since about the beginning of our second year, and we knew one another, and we were in and out of various tutorials together. But anything that I was writing, I wouldn't have been talking about to anybody. I don't think it was either. I mean, certainly talking to their tutors, but there were so many good people writing at that stage. And I mean, among the undergraduates, Karen Carson was the year above us, and Paul Muldoon was the year below. And then Maeve was doing what she was doing, though, say I didn't know. That I did have the feeling as I went on into my 20s that there just were too many good people doing it, and that I didn't have the confidence. Okay. But it's not sad, it was lack of confidence, it was lack of courage. And I meant it when I said it was a glorious time. You know, I remember when we studied Wordsworth, and I remember thinking about Wordsworth saying, you know, bliss was it in that time to be alive, but to be young were very heaven. It was wonderful. It was a great time. Between 18 and 22, how could it not be a great time? And I wasn't conscious of any deprivation. I was from a teaching family, and my mother and my grandmother had taught me. They were both King's scholars, and they had both given me to understand that this was a very, very good thing for me to be doing. And I've always been encouraged to read. I've been encouraged to write. There was no sense of missing out. It was just lack of courage, lack of confidence. And I think that this is much due to temperament or due to education and home background, because I do think it was the case for many women at that stage. You were expected to stand back. I spent an awful lot of my youth and childhood standing back, holding open doors, and standing at the bottom of the stairs to let people come down. And in fact, I would still do it. I Marks and Spencer's, I'd be the one standing at the door, letting everybody out. You know, so, because it was early training, you know.
Yeah, to be a good girl and polite and courteous and all the rest. So there, which is, you know, maybe okay in a way. And in a sense, I think having this background, going to a school where the Dominicans, because I went to a Dominican school too down here, and yeah, there was no sense of you're not going to go have a career or go to university or whatever, but that was because of the time. Yeah, it was getting a little later in the 60s and 70s. Anyway, I think you also comment, and so do many of the writers in the anthology, including myself, on the encouragement given by various important men like David Marcus, the great editor, Seamus Heaney, and some others. And this is something that has to be acknowledged.
Yeah, yes, and it was very important to me. I mentioned a couple of those who taught me. at university, and then it was Sam Hannibal. In my late 20s, I decided I just thought, well, you have always intended to write. You better just get on and do it. And I mentioned in my essay I'd been very ill. I'd been diagnosed with a shocking and sudden illness, and I'd been told that I was lucky, that if this had gone anywhere, I wouldn't have seen 30, and that does concentrate the mind.
Sure.
And I thought, well, you better do something. If there's any question that you're not going to see 30, then you better go and get published before you're 30. So I was teaching at the time, and so I would come home after work, and I would write. And I sent things to, not to David Marcus straight away, to Sam Hannibal. And it actually turned out it was a competition that was being judged by him and by Paul Muldoon, who was in the BBC, and I got a prize. And Paul told me afterwards, in some confusion and embarrassment, he said, I didn't know it was you. I said, well, I didn't know you were judging it. And, you didn't know those things. And in fact, I remember there was a postal strike. I had to drive up north to leave in this manuscript, painstakingly typed. And then, encouraged by that, I sent something into David Marcus, and that got a prize for the stole. And then, you're shortlisted for a Hennessy, and it really felt as if you're going to do something with this. But around about that time, I was also introduced by a friend who taught in St. Dominic's to Michael McLaverty, because I really admired his work. And when I was living in Dublin, I lived in Dublin for 8 or 9 years, I was very homesick. And things were very bad at home, but it was still home. I used to watch the Enterprise going over and thinking, I'd like to be on that. And Dublin was seen in so many of us as the promised land, but you only find out where home is when you're not there. And I discovered my roots, I didn't flourish outside here. So Michael, my history did to him, and it was wonderful. He said, yes, you have it. Yes, you're a writer. And that was great validation.
That's great validation.
Yes. And then he most unexpectedly gave me charge of his papers. And these papers were letters from Mary Lavin and Frank O'Connor and Daniel Corkery and the young Seamus Heaney, the young Brian Friel. So there was nothing for it but to do something with this. It was a great privilege. And then I thought, well, then you should give yourself the discipline of something. So that's how I came to write the PhD. But in the middle of that, I was having children, and as you do, and that was the other thing.
As you do.
I don't mean to throw the word the other thing. I mean the other important people in my life. But the other thing that I mean is, I had always expected to do the things that I intended to do, but I expected to do them on top of the duties. Because I think for our generation as a woman, you did expect that you probably would marry. You probably would be responsible for a house. You probably would be responsible for children. You might be working. I was told by my mother, you hang on to your job. You just do it because, education was the most important thing. And she hadn't been able to continue hers because there was a diocesan rule that married women couldn't work. So she was very determined that my sister and myself would keep going.
Sorry, Sophia, as a teacher, she was not
as a teacher, which was considered an appropriate job for a female person. With holidays, time for children, time for this. And my grandmother had brought up 6 children and taught until she was 65, and just to, as soon as they were 3, she'd bring them in to the schools in Armagh. So you knew that these things could be done, but I expected to be able to do all of it in some way. And I think that was the expectation. I don't think I ever had the luxury of thinking you will go and be a writer and that's all you have to do. And that you would have to, nobody used the term multitasking, but did rather expect. So to have all of that encouragement from so many people, David Marcus and Sam Hannibal and Michael McLaverty, and also from people like Mary Heaney. And Mary Heaney was marvelous, wonderful encourager, and she herself was a very important editor, and she was doing so much work herself. When I really did trip over the facts about Jane Austen's nieces living, dying, and being buried in Ireland. It was to Seamus and Mary that I went, and Mary launched that for me. So I always had a number of people who were encouraging me. And I'd never thought to myself, this is a man crushing on a woman. There just were people who were going to make it possible for women to be the best that it could possibly be.
Okay, thank you. That's, as I say, people have different perspectives and views in the anthology, and I think your piece, what you said just now, brings that out and throws a lot of light on how experiences can be different, because we do have to reconcile the fact that, you know, there are great individuals in the nightmare of history, as they say. The beauty of the individual shines through. So even though certain individual teachers and writers and so on were undoubtedly tremendously encouraging of women, you still get something like the debacle of the Field Day anthology in 1991, but we haven't. So that you know, there are all kinds of contradictions. It's very complex. Really,
there are many contradictions. There are many contradictions, and since I've been doing more in writing, the strongest encouragers that I would find now, those the people I turn to are women, and I've seen and felt that grow. And I felt, you know, as I think I said from the outset, I didn't have a feminist awakening. The thing that woke me was to lose my identity in the hospital. My name disappeared. And if your name disappears, who are you? Yeah,
and you write so eloquently about that in the essay in the book. So
reasserting the name, finding the name again, that is then what made me realize, no, just hang on, I'm not just someone's wife, someone's daughter. I'm not, and I have to get on and do what I need to do, and that's where it comes in, and that's where it began to.
Okay, and on that note of names, can we turn to Anne Devlin, who writes about her name, and for whom the name was a real issue, not losing it but having it.
Yes.
And grandmothers have popped up a lot in the conversation here today, which I think is really interesting. And you start off your essay saying, I grew up in a household where my grandmother remained emotionally engaged with the events of the French Revolution. Yeah, can you expand on that? I think history and the personal have always intersected for you from the word go. And did the writing help you explore that?
Yes, thank you. The crucial thing about, I realized the crucial thing about my grandmother was that I had to establish that about her, because my father was so well known as a politician, and because I was called Anne Devlin, I had that already assumes, it sort of hijacks me as an identity. It's sort of, before I have a chance to say anything, that name it's like any the choosing of a historical name means that it feels as if you're already captive, and I had to establish that my father, who died in 1999, had a political identity, and I had to get out from under that as well. So I felt doubly burdened to express myself both as the daughter of a politician, and already, even if he hadn't been a politician, this name had sort of, there it was, and I had to know what her history was in order to get out from under that, and also to even come to terms with it. So the thing about my grandmother was that she was born in Lancashire and educated in a convent in Lancashire by French nuns who were escapees from the French Revolution. So she was the most conservative Catholic imaginable, because she regarded, it wasn't just the French Revolution, it was the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and 1956, because I was born in 51. So she was obsessed with this. That was her, she was on that side of history. At the same time, my father was on the opposite side, being a Republican. So what that taught me was that you had to, between these two identities, that a very strong woman, very well-educated woman who recited Tennyson to me. The thing about that was that you have to find a way, you love both those people, you love both, as people, and you had to find a way within that to be yourself, to find what you thought, and you couldn't adopt one or other totally strongly. You had to find what you thought first. That's the downside of it, in a sense, but it means that I'm also a playwright. Being a playwright is the most happy identity for me, because what you're doing is, and I have to point out the difference between Sophia and Maeve, is that the very, I think it's Celia de Brienne talks about standing up for a friend she takes to the library, and the librarian will let her friend in, so she walks out and protests. There's a sense in which the books were at home. My grandmother got shelves built in her house for my father, and for his books, because he he very early on went to left school at 15, and then had to retrace his steps through workers' education and through the libraries. But at the same time, because of that, his books were at home when they were left, the New Left, or the Left Club book club, and so he's very self-taught. So you're having your identity between these two things. But my mother had a huge role in all this, because my mother wanted to be an actress and wasn't allowed. Had gone on to work in accounts, and so I started. I'm in a building right now, the Linen Hall Library. Across the road, and looking out of the window, you can see the Scottish Woodland building, and that was where our drama classes were. So before I was even 10 years of age, and it was a way of gathering up all the children around and getting them out on a Saturday afternoon. I was in the Scottish Provident building with several other children who from 10 in the morning until 6 o'clock at night attended drama classes. And we did everything there. Breach Brennan was one of the people who went to those classes with me. So it had quite a good output, and the woman was a woman called May Marnon. So what I'm saying to you is, before the Troubles, before the book, before the turning to the books, the influence of the kind of the reading of plays and the performing of duologues, and from plays, so you get an introduction to Shakespeare very early on. So what I would sort of want to stress is that is actually also very much linked to a different journey, to a different writing journey. Before you get to any of that, the whole idea of that, and it's also kind of more working class. It's also more oral than what Sophia and Maeve were describing. So even though and also I had to negotiate this, just to say Maeve would have to negotiate the fact that she opens her essay with their County Antrim farming family. I had to negotiate not just the country to the city, but I had to negotiate the two classes, my grandmother's educated literary background and my father's working class roots. And I have to negotiate both of those things. And so in a way, that's the big challenge for me. And it still is a challenge for me, because when I started writing plays, I was told it's very literary, the language, and you have to listen to the dialogue. And I was also thinking of something Paula Meehan says about when she does an introduction in the Lyric Theatre did a Juno and the Paycock a few years ago, and in her introduction to Sean O'Casey, she points out, Sean O'Casey is a big influence, I have to tell you. In her introduction to Sean O'Casey, she points out that the people who lived in the Dublin tenements, they didn't have any money, but their richness was their personalities. And that's something I'm very aware of in my father's family background, and in my father being the only man in a household of women, one of whom is a matriarch who was educated at an English convent. So do you see that what I'm trying to say to you is, for me, the family drama is the most intensive. I'm captive of the family drama.
So in your own family, apart from the greater context of Belfast at the north of Ireland, there's these kind of contrasts and drama going on. So I think you're saying that on the one hand, yeah, because becoming a playwright is one of the you're one of the more unusual writers in this anthology of the 21 essays. There are a few other playwrights,
Phyllis Herbert,
yeah, and so on, but mostly they're poets and fiction writers.
Yes.
I mean, one can think of various explanations for that. One being that actually the drama, the theatre environment is still the one that is most male, it seems. But maybe there are other reasons as well. I mean, it sounds to me as if you chose playwriting partly because you were going to these drama classes across the road there, but there are deeper reasons.
Yes, and there's also I felt a tremendous loss because I had to stop going to drama classes in order to prepare for my 11 plus. So they just stopped everything. I wasn't allowed to go to the festivals anymore. I missed and I've been going for at least 6 years. And then at the age of, when I entered my 11 plus year, that was stopped. And I was told, no, you've got to concentrate on your school. You've got to get the 11 plus because basically you have no chance if you don't. I mean, that was my father and his sister, Mary, my aunt died recently. They competed as to which of their children, you know, because we were the same age, they married at the same time. And my cousin Jerry got, he was incredibly clever. And of course he went to Queen's. I actually went to the University of Ulster. And so it was very, very interesting, the competition right through. There was a terror that I wouldn't, you know, you had to go to university and you had to go to grammar school. I did get my 11 plus, but it was, the cost was I had to give up going to drama classes. And I was so bereft. And it also meant that I was, if we had Shakespeare on the bookcase, I took it down and I read it as a novel. I didn't, you know, I read it, I didn't realize, I mean, I read the plays through, all of the plays through. And also, it's very, very attractive a thing for young people to be involved in that level of, you learn the lines and you're that part for a while. And I think that's really interesting because that does impact on your whole character, where you've, and even in Colin says something in the book, I love this quote of hers. She says, I'm a great one for the Lady Macbeths. And I thought the thing about plays is they actually give you a character. And if you're trying to make sense of the characters in your life growing up, the thing about the plays is that plays are about characters. They make sense of character. And you know, whatever. And so in a way, you know, it's a way of also being allowed not to be nice and polite and opening the doors. I do that as well. But I mean, the point is, you're quite, I think my father once described me as headstrong, which is a bit of a, you know, pot calling the kettle black. And the thing is, the whole idea of you were always seen as the one who was headstrong. I mean, Maeve described a kind of craziness, which I think is a kind of camouflage, which she uses as well. It's to get to be what you need to be and to express yourself, because you can be very, not being able to be who you are is such a repression. And the whole point about Sophie's comment about the name, about the loss of her real name, that's not being even called by the name that you identify with. So that we're always looking, and the thing about any form of writing, I mean, the point of it is, I'm not in favor of impromptu plays. You do have to write, you do have to make the journey, you do have to use that part of the brain, and you do have to put it down, but but it's a way of seeing yourself, of seeing who you are. I mean, it is often, it was something of a surprise to me to see what I was engaged in once I began to write dialogue. It felt to me as if all of the dialogue I'd ever collected through trying to make sense of, and when I wrote it down, I was thinking, oh, I didn't know that I thought that. I didn't know that it even observed that characteristic of that person. And even when I'm writing it, I don't know it, because the bit of the brain that I will need to use that is the bit of the brain that is going to be the other side, and I'm going to have to put on the critical thinking to work out what I'm doing. And I think this big thing, this great liberation of creative writing, it's a great liberation. I mean, when anything's, if you can't do that, I don't know that any of us would have really survived without it. That's what I think.
Okay, this is such a deep and thoughtful conversation with the three of you. I think we could go on getting deeper and deeper into how it starts, why we write, for hours. But I think we're going to have to wrap it up soon. Can
I just say before you do that?
Yes.
I was deeply grateful to this anthology. I didn't know all those journeys that everybody made. So I need to say to you, for this endeavor, I'm deeply grateful. So thank you. And I know that
That's lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank
But in fact, I mean, you've all talked about, you know, losing your identity, losing your names, overcoming various obstacles, including having children, as we do. As Sophie said, we haven't talked about that and the impact that can have on everything in life. But actually, you've all had extremely successful careers as writers. So Medbh comments in her essay that things change a little bit as you're getting older. Can we just talk briefly about that before we finish? Do you know, what keeps you going? And do you experience something that can be very broadly called ageism as you move on through life?
Yeah, okay. Do you want to talk about that, Medbh?
Well, I think as a poet, you know, you're doing different things with the language and the words, and I'm working on a tome at the minute, which deals a lot with what Sophie went through with her really serious illness. And I think that's something that, you know, if you've survived a really serious illness into our age group, that gives you, I think, what Sophie was saying about confidence. You know, you sort of are grateful that you've reached the age you're at and that you have something new to say about that stage. And it's not to do with children, it might be to do with grandchildren, you know. So it's wonderful to have reached that age that you have grandchildren, and to be able to write about that. And also then to prepare for death, you know, we really are, and we're not just going through a pandemic, we're all preparing for it, one way or another. And it's an extremely important moment. And I think people will be interested in what we all do say about that.
Yes, can I just to echo that? Both Anne and Medbh said, reading this extraordinarily informative and illuminating book, for which I do thank you and Alan at Arlen House. I didn't realise what other people were going through at the same time, and I hold myself responsible for that. You know, for not having the courage to step out, to strike out into the angry waters, even though they were out there. But like Medbh, I'm very glad to have got to this stage in my life, and to have the confidence that comes now. It would have been nice to have it when young. It would have been great. I think if I were young again now, I would be more assertive. And I have passed that on as best I can to my children, one boy, one girl. And I see that my daughter can be assertive when she needs to be. And I encourage that in her. And I will encourage it in my grandchildren too. But Medbh's right. We're at an interesting stage in life. Even if there weren't the pandemic, we do have to take stock and keep going. I don't think about ageism. I really don't think about that. I think about energy. I think if I have the energy and things are working pretty well, you know, that I haven't fallen apart, that you don't have too much pain or too many pains or aches, you can get on and do it. If the technology doesn't defeat me, then I'll keep going as long as I can. I don't think about age. So the book is a great encouragement. I've said that all along this part. We need encouragers and encouragement. And at present, all the parts of my life always poured into the present. And at the present, I can see that all along there has been a great tribe of women writers. That I didn't know that much about them isn't anybody's problem but mine. But they are there now, and I'm very conscious of how good that is and how much that helps us all to keep going on to the next wave.
Indeed. And do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think this is very difficult, this question about ageism, because it's particularly very interesting. I paid absolutely no attention, not thinking it would happen to me, when actresses would say to me, they reach 35 and they have to consider what kind of character parts they're going to go for, because they're no longer young, and they're not 35-year-olds are playing 17-year-olds. So in the theatre, it's quite an issue. I'm very conscious that if you want to write a play for, it's particularly so because you have to physically present. Actresses have to physically present, and so I'm really aware that everything I'm doing is going to be affected by the age of my characters. So if I happen to be at the age I am and I'm writing characters who are 70 to 90, well, nobody is going to be putting, because I've got a lot of coherent 70 to 90-year-olds around me, and so in a way, 70 is young, 90 is maybe getting on a bit. But and the thing is, one of the big things about theatre as well in this case, and also, I'm sorry, but if the media is commissioning, they're not going to be looking. They're going to say, no, too old. We want somebody young, because their view is that somebody young will know what now is about, whereas somebody of 70 won't. So there is an ageism issue in my form. Okay, more in my form than perhaps. So no wonder, therefore, I'm writing short stories. Because I am writing short stories, and I have an agreement with Arlen House that they will publish my collection. So I'm working on that at the moment, getting it ready. But the crucial thing is, and so in a way I can get off the issue of age, but it's absolutely crucial in the theatre. Age is everything, so because that's going to be the case. And so you've just got to kind of take it on the chin and insist on writing what you're writing. So I am indeed intending to finish a play that I'm working on where the characters are between 70 and 90. And so I'm not going to be deterred by that, but it's an issue. There's no question it's an issue.
Okay. So it's an issue in the theatre and probably on TV and so on.
Dairy Girls are playing 17-year-olds. They're in their 30s, the actresses,
But I suppose the great thing about all of you is, all of us, we were born in the 1950s, we're still here, and
yes,
we're still writing, and we have, as you say, I think, and we insist on writing what we want to write, because as Sophie pointed out, we gain confidence as we get move towards the granny stage or become grandmothers, and let's hope we have wisdom. I think this conversation with the three of you indicates that there's kind of a great richness of experience, of knowledge, and of wisdom that you have, and that I think all of the contributors to the book have. So on that note, maybe we will say good night and thank you to everyone who's joined us for this really totally I knew it was going to be delightful and interesting, and it has exceeded my expectations. So thank you, Maeve, Sophia, and Anne.
Thank you, Éilís.
Well, I would just like to echo those thanks from Éilís and thank everyone who was involved with the interview this morning. Sophia mentioned there about not letting technology defeat us, and I think we battled through that bravely this morning and tonight, so hopefully there weren't too many problems. We will have time for maybe a handful of questions, so if there are, if you have any questions or comments, you can just pop them into the chat box. And I think all of our authors are online with us, so hopefully your question will get answered if you have one. It's not often the Linen Hall Library crowd are so shy about coming forward. Or maybe we could ask Éilís. Éilís, is there anything that you didn't get to ask this morning that that you might like to put to our writers now? Sorry, I will just take you off mute here, Éilís.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, well, there are hundreds of things we could have talked about, and I felt that this morning the session with Sophia and Medbh was so rich and raised so many real questions about, you know, why we do it, what writing is about. Apart from, I mean, in one sense, we're talking about the context and, you know, whether women are encouraged or not encouraged. And my theory is that we were lucky with the timing of our births, that we kind of grew up and evolved developed as writers in a period when things were getting better and better all the time for women in general and for women writers as well. But what I found most interesting, and I think the facts, I mean, that's a matter for historians and for statistics, and there isn't really any doubt about it, that the scene has changed dramatically as far as certainly fiction writers and I think poets are concerned, as Anne Devlin was pointing out, for playwrights and so on. That lags behind as far as the women issue is concerned, and I have various ideas myself about why that is, but it's a big question. But I thought what was most interesting about what the speakers this morning and now had to say was really about more deeper issues about the impetus to write, that they all have their personal reasons for doing it, and how, you know, I mean, to say I'm compelled to write, it's such a cliche that I shudder to even quote it, but that does seem to be the reality for so many of us, that no matter what happens, this is something we really want to do. I thought that was the most important thing about something that came through the discussion this morning.
Thank you, Éilís. We have a question in from Rosalie. I think I know what the answer to this is going to be, but she has asked, is it too late to start writing at 69? I'll take all of our writers off mute, and we just get a quick answer from okay, Sophia.
Of course, it's not too late. I mean, the thing about writing, and one of the reasons that there have been women writers from the period when women were actually taught to read and write, which for most of us, that is a relatively recent thing. You know, we shouldn't forget that either, that universal literacy doesn't happen until about the beginning of the 20th century. In Ireland, in the places where my ancestors came from, Ramelton in Donegal, where Jane Austen's nieces went, you know, out there in those remote Gaeltacht regions, most people didn't read and write until in the early years of the 20th century. But for middle class people, better off people, like Jane Austen and the Brontes and so on, not that they were terribly well off, but anyway, they were educated. They could write because writing is cheap, and writing novels and poems is cheap. All you need is a quire of paper and a pen, and you know, the ability to sneak off somewhere for half an hour or an hour a day, which sometimes is all they had, and do it. So yeah, and writing there's Jane Smiley in her fantastic book, 13 Ways of Reading and Writing the Novel, or something, the title is something like that, maybe 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel, says there's no barrier to writing. If you're literate, if you can write, just do it. So age is not an issue. And so the person who is 69, yeah, go right ahead. You probably have something very interesting to say. I mean, having a story to tell is maybe an important prerequisite. Yeats writes, "I sought a theme and sought it in vain." And I think for young writers who have, who know they can write, who long to write, sometimes finding the theme is a real issue. But that's not going to be an issue if you're 69. You have lots of themes. You have stories.
Yes, that's true. I think if you're asking the question, Rosalie, you know that there's nothing to stop you. And Éilis says, you don't have to find a theme, but I think quite often the theme finds you. And you probably know already what it is you want to write about. And if the question is whether you can do that at 69, the answer is yes, of course you can. You can do it when it really is a question of sitting down and starting. The most terrifying thing of all, I think, is the blank page. But even to write a sentence or half a sentence, you've started. And when you start, then I think Seamus Heaney used to say to us that the important thing was getting started, keeping going, and getting started again. And that the most important bit of that was the getting started again, which essentially you have to do every day, I think.
Yes, Catherine Dunn, who I see down there, I think Catherine is with us, has a very good method. Catherine, if you're there, can you tell us what it is? Maybe she's not there, but
Yes, she is. I am here. I am here.
Okay.
Indeed. What method was that? Sorry, remind me.
It's your 50-minute.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah. It's just the sense that sometimes when we look at something that we want to write and we think, oh, I'm never going to be able to do 250 pages or a collection of poems or a collection of stories or whatever it happens to be. But I found, particularly when teaching or facilitating creative writing classes, it was a case of saying to people, okay, don't even think in terms of hours, because sometimes when we say something is going to take hours, it already has a negative connotation. So when I'm trying to get started, I just give myself 50 minutes, not even 1 hour, just 50 minutes, no distractions, no phone, no coffee, not answering the door, none of those things, just 50 minutes when I know I'm not going to be distracted. And sometimes even if nothing happens on that 50 minutes, when you go back for the second session of 50 minutes, things do begin to happen because psychologically you've given yourself the correct stuff. And I've been writing now professionally for more than 30 years, and it still works for me, and it helps get over that getting started and then getting started again. That time where you feel you really don't want to go back because you don't feel you're making progress. If you just say to yourself, it's only 50 minutes, that's all I have to do. And, practice it and it will work. That's guarantee. Good. Thank you.
It's absolutely excellent advice. And I heard Catherine giving it to a class a couple of years ago, and I still take it on board after loads of books and so on. Yeah.
So we had another question there from Rachel. So I'd like to put this to Maeve and Anne and Sophia. What are the issues facing women today? I assume that means just in the writing world rather than the myriad of issues that are facing women today. But are there any issues facing women that you come up against?
That's a very difficult question, because I think that's what we were talking about this morning.
Oh, yeah, the whole time.
I suppose there's one thing I would think about the issues facing women today. Are they different from the issues facing us? I came across, when I was getting ready for this, a series of articles that came out in 1980, when I would just have been getting started. Many of us would have been getting started. And it was 2 articles in the Irish Times by L.G. Gillespie, and they were called The Rise and Rise of the Lady Short Story Writer. I don't think anybody these days would use the term lady short story writer. And it was a very interesting article because we were being treated as a phenomenon. And we shouldn't have been treated as a phenomenon, because there always have been women writers. So I was rather shocked by that, to go back to that, to see that in 1980, it was still considered an unusual thing. And I wonder whether the issues that face women writers don't change that much, that it is a question of being properly accepted. In the course of the article, David Marcus was interviewed, and he made the point. He said, well, at the moment, and he's talking about the late 70s, early 80s, he said the best writing that I'm coming across for his New Irish Writing in the Irish Press, the best writing I'm coming across is coming from women. But is it a question, I wonder, that there always has to be something to be proved, even with the new generation of women writers who are coming along? So I know it's a terrible thing to answer a question with a question, but I think that's what I have to do, is to ask myself and put it back to the questioner. Does the questioner think that there are different issues apart from the ones that we were talking about earlier today?
I just want to echo what Sophie says about what we all feel we were talking about, but to add, and what came out was the 3 of us have had an education. We've all been university educated. I do think that's very significant. We are of the generation that went to, I know with people have different backgrounds, but the 3 of us have been educated, at least at university level. And I came across something, a statistic, and this is to do with affording education. And how important education is, even whatever how we determine to use it. But we're of the generation that in the 1960s, and the figure I've come across, 1963, is that in the 1920s, there were more women PhD students in American universities, and more women undergraduates than there were in 1963, that it was a question of 20% of women at American universities had PhDs, and the undergraduate population was something 47%. By 1963, it was 11% were doing PhDs and 38% were graduates. Now, that is a decline. So I think it doesn't, and my sense of being what I've always regarded as a member of the 60s generation, that allowed me certain privileges, and indeed allowed me to even face the fact that I could go and be a dramatist, whereas my mother went and found employment. I could afford to be a working dramatist. That won't happen now. And what's worrying me is the huge gaps, these huge educational gaps that are going to happen as a 3rd level education is being priced away from a whole generation of people who haven't got money behind them. I think that's really, this social inequality for me is the issue that and particularly as it is reflected in education in the funding of libraries, in the whole access to all kinds of things which we had took for granted. That's a big issue for me. You know, I think that's a big issue today.
I think we will possibly just wrap up after this question, but this is quite a quick one, so I'll just put it to all four of our guests. Which women writers inspired you?
Catherine Mansfield, Helen Waddell, Mary Lavin, for starters.
For me, definitely the Brontes, especially Charlotte Bronte, Edith Wharton, I absolutely adore. Alice Munro as the greatest short story writer of our time. Yeah, those ones. Yeah, first, yeah. I mean, there are so many, but
there's so many. There's just so many.
But I should say, because this is something that comes through the book all the time, through the anthology, Look, It's a Woman Writer, that the two writers that are most often mentioned in this book are
Edna O'Brien, I'm sure.
No, Enid Blyton and and Louisa May Alcott, and
that's true, yeah.
And so many of the writers, our writers, us, and there are many other women from the same generation, were readers when they were little kids, and they were reading Little Women, and they were reading lots and lots of books by women writers, because all the children's writers were women writers. It's only when you get into college that that kind of change, well, school, I suppose, but definitely college, that it just all reverses, and suddenly there are no women writers. It's the other side of the coin. It's really, really fascinating.
That's quite right. That's quite right. And Nesbit. Every time my mother sold a story, there were buns for tea in the Railway Children. That is very true.
It's simply true. And when you go through the essays in the book, the children's writers come up again and again, and they were there at the start, and they're mostly female.
Yeah, it's true. It is true.
I have to say that Edna O'Brien is a great model, because she's still in there. She's still defending the almost indefensible, and she won't be cancelled by anyone, and she continues. I would really say Edna.
Yeah. Margaret Atwood, more recently, very important too.
Yes.
I think Margaret Atwood has shaken us all up and made us rethink many things. Still doing it. The list would be endless, really. You know, that's a question you'd have to take away and think about for a week.
Yeah, yeah.
And it'd be a good question too.
Thank you.
Well, I think we will let everyone take that question away and ponder it for a week or however long it takes. You've named quite a lot of really great authors there for people, if they haven't read them, to maybe check them out. And of course, you should all, if you have not already done so, read Look, It's a Woman Writer. I would like to thank Éilís and Sophia and Medbh for joining us this evening. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming along, giving up your evening. We couldn't run these events without your support. I'd extend a welcome to you to visit our website, linenhall.com. There you can view the rest of our upcoming events program. You can find out more about the Extraordinary Women Project and learn more about becoming a member of the library. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.
And thank you to the library, Scott. Thank you to you and to the library for facilitating this for us.
Thank you.